There are moments in life that leave such a deep scar that you begin to question whether it's ever possible to be the same again. Sometimes all it takes is one act, one betrayal, for the world you've spent years building to crumble in seconds. My name is Alex Connors, and when I think about that day, about the events that unfolded before my eyes, it feels like it wasn't me, but someone else. Like it was someone else's life. But the truth is, it's my story. A story of love, pain, betrayal, and ultimately the choice I made to save myself. I had always felt that my wife, Sarah, was a person who could be counted on in any situation. We lived together for almost 10 years, and in that time I learned to trust her more than anyone else. She was my rock, my joy, the one who supported me through the hard times. Our relationship was never perfect. Who has a perfect relationship anyway? We quarreled, made peace, sometimes went off into our own world. But despite this, I was always sure that Sarah was being honest with me. That's why when I started noticing changes in her behavior, I didn't even pay attention to it at first. She became more absent-minded, she stayed late at work more often, her cell phone, which used to be lying around, suddenly became the object of special protection. Every time it rang, she left the room, or answered briefly and dryly, trying not to attract my attention. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Sarah is a responsible woman, maybe she's going through a busy period at work. Maybe she's tired. Maybe I'm just imagining things, because our marriage was strong. At least that's what I thought, but one night, everything changed. Sarah had left her phone on the kitchen table, and for the first time it occurred to me that I might want to check it. I wasn't proud of myself at that moment, but some kind of premonition compelled me to act. Turning on the screen, I saw a notification, a message from an unknown number. The words I read felt like they were weighing down on me. Miss you. Same time tomorrow. I couldn't breathe. Everything inside me turned upside down. At first I tried to make excuses. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a mistake. Maybe it was one of her friends. But the more I looked, the clearer it became that it wasn't a friendly correspondence at all. I scrolled through her messages and saw dozens more of them, words full of a passion and intimacy I hadn't felt from her in a long time. This wasn't just flirting. It was more than that. My heart clenched, my mind fogged. I felt both crushed and enraged at the same time. Why? Why had she done this to me? What had I done wrong? I couldn't sleep that night. Lying in bed next to her, listening to her measured breathing, I tried to figure out how to move on. The next morning, I didn't say anything. Instead, I decided to gather evidence. It wasn't out of revenge, but because I wanted to make sure my feelings weren't playing tricks on me. I installed a tracking app on her phone, followed her movements, read her correspondence. Every day brought new pain, new evidence of her betrayal, but that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was pretending nothing was happening when everything inside you was on fire. I watched her at breakfast, listened to her stories about work, the way she lied to my face with ease, and it broke me harder and harder. After a few weeks, when I had gathered enough evidence to leave no doubt, I decided it was time to take action. I couldn't live in these lies any longer. In those days, when my suspicions were finally solidified, I began to observe the world as if through a dirty glass. Everything that had seemed ordinary before suddenly took on strange colors. Sarah's morning smiles over coffee seemed strained, her voice a little louder than usual when she talked about things at work. As if she were trying to distract me from something important, I began to notice how she increasingly retreated to her bedroom with her phone in hand, or how quickly she changed the subject when I casually asked questions about her plans for the day. They were little things that, when isolated, meant nothing. But altogether they added up to a picture that made me lose my peace. Every time I met her gaze, I had the urge to ask, why? But I held back. I waited. Perhaps I hoped she would confess on her own, or that it would all turn out to be a big misunderstanding. Instead of accusing her directly, I tried to find an explanation for her actions. Maybe I wasn't paying enough attention to her. Maybe I was getting too caught up in work. After all, marriage is something complicated, and maybe I missed the moment when she started to feel lonely. I spent every evening in reflection, going over in my head all of our conversations over the past few months. Were there hints in them that I hadn't noticed? Moments that I had ignored? These days I became withdrawn. At work, my colleagues asked me if I was okay, but I just waved it off, saying I was just tired. In fact, the fatigue was deeper than physical. I felt like I was pulling a huge weight that was about to crush me. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Sarah came home later than usual. She smiled at me as if nothing had happened and tossed her keys on the shelf by the door. "You haven't had dinner yet?" she asked, walking past me. I nodded, not taking my eyes off her face. She looked tired, but not the kind of tiredness you get after a long day at work. It was a different kind of tiredness, a contentment and lightness that was hard to explain in words. "Was it a hard day today?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She froze for a second, then turned to me and shrugged. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Just a lot of work." Her answer sounded too fast, too indifferent. I felt the anger rising in me again. But I suppressed it. I knew that if I let my emotions take over, I'd ruin everything before I had time to figure out how to deal with it. When Sarah left to go to the bathroom, I was alone in the silence. Her phone was on the table, but this time I didn't even try to pick it up. I had enough evidence to know the truth. But what was I going to do with it? It took me a long time to fall asleep that night. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling while Sarah slept next to me, breathing quietly. It was a strange feeling, being around someone who betrayed you and yet not being ready to let them go. I thought about our past. About how we met in college. About how I confessed my love to her under a starry sky on the roof of the old dorm. About the way she looked at me then, with such sincerity that I was ready to swear I would never love anyone else as much in my life. I remembered our wedding, how she whispered in my ear that I was the best, that she would never need anyone else. I believed every word she said then, and now I was lying here in this room, next to her, feeling the past and the present collide inexorably. Leaving me at a loss. The next day, I started watching her again. Not because I needed more evidence, but because I was trying to understand her motives. What exactly made her go for it? I noticed how her smiles became less and less frequent. How she began to avoid my touch. I noticed how she spent more time in front of the mirror picking out clothes for work than usual. These were all signs I may have missed before, but the real blow came one morning when I heard her talking on the phone in the bathroom. Her voice was quiet, but I could make out every word. "No, he doesn't know anything. Yes, everything is going according to plan. I miss him too." At that moment, something broke inside me. The doubts I was still trying to keep alive were gone. All that was left was the truth, and it was devastating. The next day I felt like a person stuck between two realities. One was the familiar, where Sarah was still my wife, the woman I had once trusted with everything. The other was an ugly one, ruined by betrayal, where she was hiding her second life from me. My actions became more and more mechanical. Breakfast, work, dinner, all of it was becoming an empty routine, devoid of meaning. Sarah didn't seem to notice anything. Perhaps she was too preoccupied with her own thoughts, or perhaps she was so sure I would never know the truth, but I noticed everything. Every look she gave me, every carelessly spoken phrase. Even the smell of the new perfume that had appeared on her in the last couple weeks irritated me. It seemed as foreign as she was. That night, when I heard her talking on the phone, I realized I couldn't keep quiet anymore. But instead of making a scene, I decided to act differently. The next day, after waiting until Sarah left for work, I stayed home. I could no longer sit idly by without knowing the whole truth. I needed to find evidence that would put everything in its proper place. I searched our house, trying to find anything that might confirm my suspicions. Her bag, her drawers, even her laptop, all of it became my target. I felt awful, like I was betraying her by invading her personal space. But every time I remembered her voice whispering words of love to someone else, my anger overpowered my guilt, and I found it. There were messages in her emails. They weren't particularly explicit, but they were enough to know she was having an affair. In one of the emails, she was arranging a meeting at some hotel. In another, she thanked me for a wonderful evening. Those words seemed to burn me from the inside out. I pictured them. Her and this man. Their smiles, their touches, the moments she was to share with me. When Sarah came home that night, I tried to act normal. I made dinner, talked to her about her day, pretended I didn't know anything. But inside, I was a volcano ready to erupt at any second. "You're kind of quiet tonight," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. I just shrugged. "A little tired," I replied. She smiled, and her smile seemed mocking. That night I made a decision. I couldn't live this lie anymore. But I didn't want it to end simply. I wanted her to feel the same pain she had caused me. The next day, I found a lawyer. I told him everything, showed him the evidence I had gathered, and he assured me that I had a strong case. We started preparing for the divorce, but I wasn't in a hurry. I wanted to wait for the moment that would leave an unforgettable mark in her life. Every day, my emotions became harder to control. Anger, pain, confusion, they were changing each other like waves in a storm. Sometimes I found myself wanting to scream, to throw things away, to tear up everything that reminded me of her. But in those same moments, a strange silence enveloped me. I would spend hours sitting on the edge of our bed, looking at family photos on the wall. One showed us at the beach, laughing, hugging each other like the whole world belonged to us. The other was our first New Year's Eve in this house, Sarah in a silly patterned sweater, pouring hot chocolate. I stared at her face and tried to figure out, was she sincere in those moments? Or was there already a shadow lodged somewhere deep in her heart that I just didn't notice? One day I decided to distract myself. I took my car and drove out of town, just to spend some time alone. I stopped at the lake where Sarah and I had once spent our first vacation together. I remember her jumping into the cold water then, screaming that she would definitely catch a cold now if I didn't jump in after her. And then, shivering from the cold, she wrapped herself in a blanket and looked at me like I was the only person in her world. And now, looking at the same lake, I could feel that memory turning into a ghost that no longer brought me joy. Returning home, I noticed something strange. On the living room table was a box that wasn't there before. It was a small wooden box with a lock. I knew it belonged to Sarah, but I had never seen it open. Curiosity took over. I took out a small tool to pry open the lock. Inside I found letters, old photos, and most importantly, a diary. I didn't know if it was right to read it. Part of me screamed that it was a violation of every possible boundary. But another part wanted to find answers. I opened the diary. Its pages were filled with Sarah's neat handwriting. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like our love is fading. John is so familiar. He's a good husband, but sometimes I feel like I'm just existing around him instead of living. Those words came over me like a cold shower. I continued to read, and with each page my pain intensified. She wrote about the feelings that plagued her. How she met him, how he made her feel alive. I closed the journal and put it back in the box. That night I couldn't sleep. Her words rang in my head, John. Familiar. They echoed in my thoughts, shattering my self-respect to pieces. The next day, I decided it was time to take action. But I didn't yet know exactly how I would act. All I knew for sure was that I couldn't let her get away that easily. Every morning I woke up feeling heavy, like someone had ripped a part of me out. Sarah was there, she was still looking at me with a slight worry in her eyes, but I knew, she was no longer the woman I had once loved. That look was full of an invisible wall between us that I couldn't overcome. I could no longer trust her, and that knowledge was consuming me from the inside out. The whole routine had become a farce. I'd come home and pretend everything was fine, but her words from her diary kept running through my mind. How she felt like I was just part of everyday life for her. It pained me to realize that I was habitual, and everything she once loved about me was now just a shadow to her. As the days passed, I realized that no more lies would remain hidden. I needed to face the truth, no matter how bitter it was. I knew she was seeing him. Sometimes, when she thought I wasn't paying attention, I noticed the way she picked out her clothes, hiding a smile that wasn't for me. It was another little reminder of how her world was filled with someone else. One day I came home earlier than usual. In the hallway, I noticed that her shoes, which she usually left in the bedroom, had been left right at the entrance. I froze, listening for any sound that might give away her presence. Soon I heard footsteps, and she appeared in front of me. "Sarah, you're here so early," she said with slight surprise. She was obviously trying to hide the tension in her voice, but I noticed it instantly. "I didn't realize you weren't at work today," I replied with a cold smile. She froze in place. There was a flicker of consternation in her eyes, but she quickly smoothed it out and a familiar mask appeared on her face. I was a little out of it," she mumbled, trying to hide her nervousness. "Don't worry, it's fine," I didn't say anything back, just walked past her and headed for the bedroom. Sarah followed me, her footsteps seeming heavy, as if she knew that she was carrying not only this house, but everything I knew about us on her shoulders. It had been weeks since the day Sarah had confessed her feelings for someone else to me. Every day reminded me of the endless struggle with myself. I thought about breaking up with her right away, kicking her out the door, but something inside me made me slow things down. Maybe it was the faint hope that things could still be fixed. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to let her go completely. We barely spoke. She avoided my gaze, tried to stay out of my sight, but I could feel her presence in every corner of the house. Her things, her scent, even the faint rustle of her footsteps, all of it reminded me that our life was falling apart. One night I noticed her cell phone was left on the kitchen table. She had forgotten to pick it up while leaving upstairs. I stared at the device for a long time, wondering if I should find out more about her relationship with this man. Finally, I picked up the phone in my hands. The screen was locked, but I knew her password, the same one she'd set years ago, back in the days when there were no secrets between us. I entered it, and the phone unlocked. The first thing that caught my eye was a chat room with the name Michael. I opened the correspondence, and everything I read made my heart clench tighter and tighter. "You make me so happy, Michael. I feel alive when you're around. John is starting to suspect something, but I can't just give up everything. It's so hard. When are we going to see each other again? I miss you." Each message was like a blow to my chest. I could feel my anger growing with every line I read. They were discussing moments that Sarah and I had never shared. Their words were full of passion and warmth that had long since disappeared from our relationship. I put my phone back on the table, trying not to give away my emotions. But there was a fire brewing inside me. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay away any longer. I found out where this Michael guy worked through one of the messages. Sarah had casually mentioned his place of employment, and I took advantage of that information. When I arrived at his office, I sat in the car for a long time trying to decide what to do next. Confrontation? Or just surveillance? My heart was pounding like crazy. I knew everything was at stake, but I couldn't let myself go without answers. After a while, I saw Michael walk out of the building. Tall, confident, with the same easy smile that had apparently won Sarah over. I followed him, keeping my distance. He went to a cafe nearby, sat down at a table, and ordered a coffee. I watched him from behind the glass window. The man seemed to be living an ordinary life, unaware of how his actions had ruined mine. At some point, I gathered my courage and stepped inside. My footsteps echoed in the silence of the cafe. I walked over to his table and sat across from him. "Michael, right?" I asked, looking straight into his eyes. He looked up in surprise. I guess he hadn't expected to see me. "Who are you?" he asked, frowning slightly. "My name is John." Sarah's husband. His face paled at that moment. He tried to hide his excitement, but I could see his hands trembling slightly. "Look," he began, "I don't know what she's told you, but I don't need to know what she told me," I interrupted him. "I know enough." He fell silent, obviously not knowing what to say. I went on, "You know she's married. You knew from the beginning, and you went ahead with it anyway." You didn't even try to hide it. You destroyed my marriage, my family. What do you think I should do now?" Michael couldn't find an answer. He just sat there in front of me, torn between fear and guilt. I stood up and looked at him one last time. "Enjoy it, Michael. But remember, everything has a price." I walked out of the cafe, leaving him in a state of shock. I didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain, this was just the beginning of the end. After my meeting with Michael, I returned home with a heavy heart. My confrontation with him didn't bring relief. It didn't give me back my self-respect, it didn't take away the pain. The only thing I felt was anger. But now I knew for sure, I had to move on. But how do you do that when the past is at your throat? Sarah welcomed me home as usual. Her face seemed calm, but I knew it was just a mask. She was cooking something in the kitchen and the smell of herbs and roasted meat was in the air. This scene could have been part of our old, happy past, but now it seemed fake. "How was your day?" she asked without turning around. I didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway, watching her movements. Finally, she turned around and met my gaze. "Is something wrong?" Her voice shook, and I saw a shadow of worry in her eyes. "Yes, something happened," I answered. I ran into Michael, her face went pale. Sarah froze in place, and the knife she held in her hand slowly dropped to the table. "You, what?" Her voice grew quieter. "I said I met him," I repeated, taking a step towards her. "Did you think I was just going to watch in silence as you destroyed everything we built?" She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. Her eyes filled with tears and she turned away abruptly as if she wanted to hide her guilt. "John, please. I didn't mean for things to go this far." "You didn't?" I interrupted her, feeling my voice growing louder. "Then why did you let it happen? Why did you keep seeing him, knowing how it was destroying me?" Sarah covered her face with her hands and her shoulders shook with quiet crying. I could feel the anger inside me growing, but now it was starting to be replaced by other emotions: frustration, fatigue, sadness. "Do you realize I can't trust you anymore?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything we had, you've ruined." She looked up at me, her eyes full of tears. "I know, John. And I'm sorry. I made a mistake. But I want to make it right." Her words were sincere, but they lacked power. She had already lost my trust, and it was almost impossible to get it back. The next day, I decided to take my mind off the situation. I called my longtime friend Mark, who had always been a support to me. We met at a bar where we drank beer and talked about life. "Are you sure you want to keep doing this?" Mark asked me when I told him what had happened. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to forgive her, but the other part says I shouldn't." "The problem is that forgiveness isn't just words," Mark said. "It's a decision you make every day. And if you're not sure you can do it, then maybe you should move on." His words touched me. I realized that forgiveness isn't just about forgetting what happened. It means living with it, not letting it destroy you. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me. She was sitting on the couch with her hands crossed in her lap, her face expressing determination. "John," she began as I entered. "I can't live like this anymore. I know I've ruined everything, and I don't apologize. But I want you to know. I love you." Her words hit me like a thunderclap. I stared at her for a long time, trying to see if she was sincere. But even if it was true, I wasn't sure I had the strength to believe in her love again. "Sarah," I said quietly, "love isn't words. It's an action. And until you prove to me that you're willing to change everything, I can't believe you again." She nodded, and I saw something new in her eyes. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was despair. After our conversation with Sarah, I felt devastated. Her confessions, tears, and words of love didn't bring relief. Instead, they added more confusion to my already broken mind. That night, I hardly slept at all. Lying in the dark, I remembered our best moments, the days when we laughed, loved each other, made plans for the future. And each memory cut me like a knife. I realized that it was all in the past. The marriage we had created, the home that had seemed like an impregnable fortress, was now a ruin. And despite her attempts to win me back, I knew that no words could erase what she'd done. The next day I decided to talk to an attorney. Not because I had already made the decision to divorce, but because I needed to prepare myself for any outcome. The attorney, an older man with a soft but professional voice, listened to my story and asked me some direct questions. Do you want to save your marriage? Or do you want to protect yourself? Those words got me thinking. Did I want to save our marriage? And if so, why? Was it love? Or was it fear of being alone? When I got home, Sarah was in the bedroom packing her things. I caught her off guard, but she didn't look surprised. I thought it would be easier for you if I left, she said quietly, avoiding my gaze. Is that your decision? I asked. Feeling something inside me break, she stopped and turned to me. John, I made a mistake, a huge mistake. And I realize that I'm the source of your pain right now. If my love for you means anything, then maybe the best thing I can do is walk away so you can find peace. Her words caught me off guard. I was ready for anger, for excuses, but not this. You think leaving will solve everything? I asked, feeling a mixture of anger and despair stirring in my chest. Do you want to just run away so you don't have to see the consequences of your actions? Sarah lowered her head and I stepped closer to her. Leaving isn't a decision, I continued. It's an escape. You have to realize what you've destroyed. To face it and accept the consequences. She sobbed, but didn't answer. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing by making her stay. Maybe I just wanted her to feel the pain I was going through. That night we slept in separate rooms again. There was a silence in the house that seemed even heavier than usual. I thought about what I had said to her and tried to figure out if it was the right thing to do. A few days later, Sarah took the first step. She made an appointment with a marriage counselor and suggested I go with her. I know it won't fix what I did, she said. But maybe it will help us figure out how to move forward. I agreed, not because I believed in success, but because I wanted to at least try. Our sessions with the therapist began with tense silence. I didn't want to talk about my feelings, and Sarah didn't seem to know where to begin. But over time, we began to open up. I talked about my pain, my anger, how her betrayal made me feel worthless. She, in turn, confessed that she herself was lost, that she wasn't looking for love on the side, but had found it where she didn't expect it. These conversations were agonizing, but they forced us both to face the truth. One evening after another session, we were sitting in the living room at home. Sarah was looking at me with some new, unfamiliar determination. John, I would do anything to earn back your trust, she said. But I realize that you may not want to. And if that's the case, I'll accept your decision. Her words sounded sincere, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like she actually realized what she'd done. But I still wasn't sure if I was ready to forgive her. At this point, I realized that the end of this story had not yet come. The resolution, whatever it was, would take time. It had been a few weeks since we started going to therapy. A lot had changed in that time, though I wasn't sure if it was for the better. Each conversation with the therapist opened new wounds, causing me to relive the pain of betrayal all over again. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed more determined. Not only did she share her thoughts, but she began to actively change her behavior. She stopped avoiding conversations about the future, and began spending more time at home, reorganizing our life together. She even offered to temporarily delete her social media to avoid temptation and prove that she was ready to focus on us. But despite her best efforts, I couldn't get rid of one question: could I believe her again? Every night I pondered this question, going over our last years in my mind. I remembered her smile, our travels, her care that once seemed genuine. And with that, I saw the moment I'd caught her with Michael in front of me again. That image kept me going, ruining every attempt to start over. One night I decided I needed a distraction. I pulled out an old toolbox and started repairing our patio that I had wanted to fix for a long time. Working with wood always calmed me down, helped me focus. After a while, Sarah came out to me. She watched in silence as I tightened the screws, then she asked cautiously, Can I help? I looked at her, and in her eyes I saw a genuine desire to be there for me. In years past, she had rarely been interested in such things, but now her tone and expression said that she really wanted to be involved in my affairs. Okay, I replied, handing her the screwdriver. Let's see how you do. We spent the rest of the evening together working on the terrace. It was strange, almost unreal, but for a while I felt like we could be a team again. A few days later, the unexpected happened. Michael appeared on our doorstep. I didn't immediately recognize him. He looked older, tired, and depressed. We need to talk, John, he said, avoiding my gaze. Sarah was home at the time. And when she heard his voice, she came out into the hallway. Her face went pale and she tensed like a string. What are you doing here? She asked in a trembling voice. I didn't come here to destroy anything, Michael said, raising his hands in a gesture of reconciliation. I want to apologize. His words made me wary. Why would he apologize after all this time? I made a mistake, he continued. And I realize that I ruined not only your life, but mine as well. I want you to know one thing, John, she began, her voice shaking, but she spoke firmly. Everything I'm doing right now, I'm doing it for you. Not for forgiveness, not so that things can go back to the way they were, but so that you can be happy, even if it's not with me. Her words burned me. I could see how she had changed over the past few months. There was no falseness in her actions, only genuine remorse. But was that enough? That night I couldn't sleep for a long time. Lying in the dark, I went over in my head everything we'd been through. I remembered her smile on our wedding day, her laughter as we decorated our first house together. I remembered her betrayal and my rage. But I also remembered her fighting for us. She had changed, that much was obvious. But could we be who we used to be again? In the morning, at the farewell ceremony, everyone was given a chance to say a final word. Sarah, I began, feeling my chest tighten. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened. But I'm willing to try to forgive. Not to get the past back, but to build something new. Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered softly, thank you. We returned home not as the same old couple, but as two people who decided to start fresh. It wasn't the end, but the beginning of a long journey. Forgiveness didn't come right away, but every day we worked on ourselves. We talked, shared feelings, built new memories. I don't know what lies ahead. But I do know one thing, pain teaches us to appreciate what we have. And sometimes a second chance is not a weakness, but a strength.